In the West, some truths are buried deeper than any grave, but the earth itself has a voice, and a faithful animal is often the first to hear its call. Silas Kane, a man whose face bore the harsh map of the Civil War, leaned his axe against a stack of uncut pine wood. The Arizona sun beat down on his property in Coyote Canyon, a place of profound silence. But the silence had been broken for 2 days. His old dog, Shadow, a rugged mix of collie and something wilder, sat rigid as a tombstone by the old, dry stone well. The dog's unwavering gaze was fixed on the crumbling rock, a sentinel watching a ghost only he could see. This stillness was unnatural, a stark contrast to the usual life of the ranch. For weeks the dog had been restless, pacing the porch under the cold moonlight and refusing his share of the evening meal. But this silent vigil was different. It held a weight that settled deep in Silas's bones. He walked across the dusty yard, his worn leather boots crunching on the parched earth. Shadow's ears twitched at his approach, but the dog's head didn't turn. His entire body was a coiled spring of tension, trembling with a fear Silas hadn't seen even in the face of a coiled rattlesnake. A cold dread began to form in the pit of his stomach. "What is it, old friend?" Silas whispered, crouching beside the animal. He laid a calloused hand on the dog's back, feeling the tremor that ran through its wiry frame. He followed Shadow's gaze into the dark maw of the well. Nothing. Just shadows, and the scent of damp, cool earth. He remembered a time, years ago, when he and Eleanor had sat by this very well, her laughter echoing in the canyon as she spoke of a future that the war had stolen from them. Her memory was a bittersweet ache, a ghost of a different kind. Then he heard it, a faint, grating sound from below, almost lost in the whisper of the wind. It was the dry scrape of stone against stone, a sound that didn't belong in the settled earth. It was a sound of disturbance, of something trying to move where nothing should be. Shadow's breathing hitched, and a low, guttural whine escaped his throat. Silas now understood. The dog's fear wasn't for a phantom. It was for something real, something buried deep in the darkness beneath their feet, waiting to be found. Dawn painted the canyon walls in hues of blood and rust, but Shadow remained at his post. He hadn't moved all night. From his kitchen window, Silas watched the dog's silhouette against the rising sun, a lonely statue of unwavering loyalty. He brewed a pot of bitter coffee, the familiar ritual doing little to calm the disquiet in his soul. The dog had grown thin, his ribs showing faintly through his thick coat. Whatever secret the well held was more powerful than hunger, more commanding than the bond they shared. Silas pulled on his worn denim jacket and stepped out into the morning chill. The air was thin and smelled of dust and sagebrush. "Still at it, boy?" he said quietly, his voice rough. He knelt beside Shadow, whose fur was damp with morning dew. The dog turned his head slowly, his yellow eyes filled with a desperate plea. He then let out a single, mournful whine, a sound so full of despair it made Silas's chest tighten. In all their years, through brutal winters and lonely nights, he'd never heard such a sound of defeat from his companion. His own unease growing, Silas's gaze fell upon the ground around the well's stone base. It was here he saw what the dog had been trying to show him all along. The earth was disturbed, not trampled by cattle or scarred by the elements, but deliberately turned. The soil was loose and dark, a stark contrast to the compacted, sun-baked clay of the rest of the yard. Someone had been digging here, and they had done so recently. The tracks were fresh, no more than a day or two old, yet no one had reason to come to his isolated ranch. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Eleanor, tracing patterns in the dust with a stick, her bright eyes looking up at him. "This land feels safe, Silas, like it could keep secrets." The memory was a sharp pang of grief. This violation felt personal, as if someone had disturbed not just his land, but his memories too. Who would venture this far out, and for what purpose? The feeling of being watched crept over him, though the vast canyon was empty. He knew then, with a cold certainty, that this was not the work of a passing stranger. It was something far more deliberate. As Silas stood contemplating the disturbed ground, Shadow suddenly went rigid. The dog's body stiffened, and his nose pointed directly toward a patch of earth right at the well's edge. He didn't growl, but a low whimper escaped his throat, a sound of pure dread. Silas moved toward the spot, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He knelt, the worn denim of his trousers sinking into the soft soil. Reaching out, he brushed away the loose dirt, his fingers searching for what the dog had sensed. His fingertips met not stone or root, but the coarse texture of fabric. Burlap. Rough and heavy. Shadow yelped and scrambled backward, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the hard-packed earth as if the ground itself had burned him. Silas stared at the exposed corner of the sack. A heavy sense of foreboding settled over him. With a deep breath, he stood and walked to the barn, his movements stiff. He returned with a shovel, its metal scraping softly against the dirt. The dog's fear was a tangible thing, a cold mist that now enveloped him as well. He drove the shovel into the loose earth. The digging was unnervingly easy. Whoever had done this had been in a desperate hurry, not even bothering to pack the soil down. They were either rushed or terrified, or both. A few feet down, the shovel's blade struck something solid but yielding, with a dull thud that vibrated up the handle. It wasn't rock. Silas's throat went dry. He tossed the shovel aside and knelt again, using his hands to clear the remaining dirt with a frantic urgency he didn't know he possessed. As he uncovered more of the burlap bundle, a sickly sweet odor rose from the shallow grave. It was a smell every rancher knew, the smell of life gone wrong, of meat left too long in the unforgiving sun. It was the smell of decay. He recoiled, his stomach churning. He could see now that the sack was wrapped around something large, its shape vaguely human. The air grew thick and heavy, and the silence of the canyon seemed to press in on him, amplifying the frantic beat of his own heart. Whatever was in that sack, it was a secret someone had killed to keep. With hands that trembled, Silas pulled at the rough twine binding the burlap. The knot gave way easily. He peeled back the coarse fabric, his breath catching in his throat. From the dark earth, a woman's hand emerged. It was pale and delicate, the fingers slightly curled, but it was still and cold with a finality that defied the morning sun. There was no wedding band on her finger, a detail his mind registered with a strange, detached clarity. The sight was a violation, an obscene intrusion into the quiet rhythm of his life. But then his eyes fixed on the wrist. Encircling it was a slender silver bracelet, intricately carved with the image of a lone coyote howling at the moon. His heart stopped. Blood roared in his ears, drowning out the gentle morning breeze. He knew that bracelet. He had commissioned it from a smith in Tucson, a gift for Eleanor Vance 5 years ago, a promise he'd made to her before the war tore them apart. He thought he would never see her, or it, again. The world tilted on its axis, and the canyon walls seemed to close in around him. A wave of shock and grief so powerful, it buckled his knees crashed over him. It was her, Eleanor. Here, buried in a shallow, unmarked grave on his land. The questions hammered at him. A merciless assault. Why? Who? How had she come to be here, in this desolate place, so far from the life she had known? The pain was a physical thing, a shard of ice in his chest. This wasn't just a body, it was the ghost of a life he might have had, a future buried before it could begin. He felt a profound, soul-crushing loss. In that moment of pure agony, a new sound cut through his grief. The rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats, fast and steady, growing louder from the direction of the main road. Someone was coming. Fast. He looked from the exposed hand to the approaching cloud of dust, his mind numb. He was standing over a fresh grave, a shovel at his feet, and the woman he had once loved lay dead in the dirt. He was no longer just a grieving man. He was a man in terrible immediate danger. The rider emerged from the dust cloud, a tall, imposing figure on a magnificent black steed. It was his neighbor, Bartholomew Thorne, a man whose vast lands bordered Silas's small ranch, a man whose wealth and influence in the nearby town of Redemption were spoken of in hushed, respectful tones. Thorne reined in his horse, his cold, calculating eyes taking in the scene with unnerving speed. The shovel, the disturbed earth, Silas kneeling by the open grave. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his gaze. "Good morning, Cain," Thorn said, his voice smooth as polished stone yet carrying no warmth. "Doing a bit of early morning landscaping, are we?" Shadow, who had been whimpering softly, now let out a low, menacing growl, the fur on his back bristling. The dog had never shown such open hostility toward Thorn before. Silas scrambled to his feet, trying to position himself to block Thorn's view of the grave, his mind racing for a plausible lie. "The well," he managed, his voice hoarse. The foundation felt loose. Thorn dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace, his expensive boots landing softly in the dust. He was a man who moved with the unshakable confidence of someone who owned the world he walked on. "Is that so?" he mused, his eyes never leaving the freshly turned soil. "That's funny." He took a step closer, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "I was under the impression we hadn't had any rain to loosen the ground." He casually pushed back his tailored coat, revealing the ornate handle of a revolver holstered at his hip. The air grew thick with unspoken threats. "I seem to have misplaced something," Thorn continued, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "Something quite valuable. I'm retracing my steps." His cold eyes finally met Silas's. "You haven't come across anything unusual, have you, Cain? Sometimes things of value get buried where they don't belong." The implication was as sharp as a blade. Thorn wasn't just asking a question. He was making a statement, and Silas knew with chilling certainty that he was looking at the man responsible for the grave at his feet. The threat hung between them, as tangible as the dust motes dancing in the sun. Thorn knew. He wasn't searching for something he'd lost, he was checking on something he'd hidden. His gaze kept flicking to the burlap sack, a predator inspecting his kill. Before Silas could form a response, his mouth dry as desert sand, Shadow erupted into a furious volley of barks, not at Thorn, but toward the mouth of the canyon. The sharp, frantic sounds echoed against the rock walls, a clear and urgent alarm. 3 riders burst from behind a rock formation, their horses churning up dust as they galloped hard toward the ranch. They were hard-looking men, their faces etched with the harsh lines of a difficult life. The man in the lead, distinguished by a jagged scar that cut across his left eyebrow, pulled his horse to a skidding halt. His eyes, small and dark like a vulture's, swept over the scene and settled on Thorn. A humorless smile twisted his lips. It was Black Jack Riley, a hired gun whose name was synonymous with trouble. "We were about to give up on you, Thorn," Riley rasped, his voice like gravel. He didn't dismount, instead looking down from his saddle with an air of impatient authority. His gaze drifted from Thorn to the disturbed earth and the partially covered grave. He nodded slowly, a dark understanding dawning on his face. "So," he said, a greedy light in his eyes, "did you find what you were paid to secure?" The words struck Silas with the force of a physical blow, connecting the dots in a terrible, undeniable pattern. It all clicked into place. Thorn hadn't acted alone. He had hired these men. This wasn't a simple crime of passion or a random act of violence. This was a conspiracy, cold and calculated. They were all connected to Eleanor's death. A dark web of greed and violence, with his small, quiet ranch now at its very center. He was no longer just a witness. He was an obstacle. He looked from Thorn's cold, aristocratic face to Riley's brutal sneer, and understood he was trapped between 2 different kinds of evil. Riley's impatience was growing. He leaned forward in his saddle, his hand resting near the firearm on his hip. "Enough of this silent play, Thorn. Where is it?" he demanded, his eyes fixed on the grave. She was supposed to have it with her. That was the deal. He clearly wasn't talking about the silver bracelet. He was after a different prize, something far more valuable. The tension stretched to a breaking point, the air crackling with the promise of violence. Everyone was watching everyone else, fingers twitching, eyes narrowed. In that suffocating silence, Shadow acted. With a desperate bark that was more a cry of fury than a warning, the dog launched himself forward. But he didn't go for Thorn or Riley. He lunged at Riley's horse. The startled animal reared back, neighing in alarm and momentarily throwing the gunman into confusion. In that brief, chaotic instant, something was dislodged from the folds of Eleanor's dress by the grave. A small, leather-bound journal tied shut with a simple ribbon fell silently into the dust. Before anyone else could react, Silas dove for it. His fingers closed around the cool leather just as Riley brought his horse back under control. "The journal!" Riley roared, his face contorted with fury. He pointed a trembling finger at Silas. "He has the journal! It holds the deed, you fool!" He turned his rage on Thorn. "You told me this would be clean! You said you'd get the document before you buried her!" The raw greed in his voice laid the final piece of the puzzle bare. It wasn't for jewelry or some petty revenge. They had murdered Eleanor for a piece of paper. A deed. A document that, in this parched land, likely controlled more than just acreage. It controlled water. It controlled life. It controlled the entire canyon. Silas clutched the journal to his chest, its small weight feeling as heavy as a gravestone. He now held the motive for her murder in his hands, and in doing so, had just become the most wanted man in the territory. The first shot splintered the air. Silas, reacting on pure instinct honed by the battlefield, threw himself behind the stone wall of the well as another shot kicked up dust where he had just been standing. His ranch had erupted into a chaotic firefight. But the shots weren't all aimed at him. Riley and his men, their faces masks of betrayal, were firing at Thorn. The greedy alliance had shattered, and now they were fighting over the spoils, with Silas and the journal caught in the deadly crossfire. Crouching behind the relative safety of the stone, he heard men shouting curses and the terrifying whine of ricocheting lead. He risked a glance over the edge. One of Riley's men was on the ground, clutching his leg. Thorn, using his dead horse as cover, was firing with cold, methodical precision. Silas's hands trembled as he fumbled with the ribbon on the journal. He had to know. He had to understand why she had died. He pulled the ribbon free and opened the book. The pages were filled with Eleanor's elegant, familiar script. The last few entries were hurried, written in a hand shaking with fear. She wrote of discovering that Thorn had used forged documents to steal her late father's land claims. She had found the original deed, signed by the territorial governor himself, a document that proved Thorn's entire empire was built on a lie. She was bringing it to the one person in the world she knew she could trust. She was bringing it to him. His eyes blurred with tears as he read the final lines, scrawled hastily at the bottom of the last page. "I am coming to you, Silas. I should have come back years ago. Whatever happens, know that I have always loved you." The words were a ghost's whisper, a final declaration that pierced his heart. He now understood the full weight of the tragedy. She hadn't been running from him or their past. She had been running to him. For help. For safety. For the love they had both lost. And he hadn't been there to save her. The eruption of gunfire had not gone unnoticed. Down the canyon road, a cloud of dust heralded the arrival of a horse-drawn buggy, moving at a speed that threatened to shake it apart. It was the buggy of Dr. Abram Croft, the elderly, respected physician from Redemption. Riding alongside him on a sturdy bay was the town's young deputy sheriff, Miller, his face pale with alarm but his hand resting firmly on his holstered firearm. The law, it seemed, was finally arriving. Their appearance threw the combatants into disarray. Thorn, ever the opportunist, immediately changed his tactics. He stood up from behind his horse, his hands raised in a gesture of feigned surrender. "Thank God you're here, deputy," he shouted, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "This man Kane has gone mad. He murdered a woman and then opened fire on us when we came to investigate." He pointed an accusing finger at Silas, who was still crouched behind the well. Silas slowly rose to his feet, his heart pounding. He held the leather journal up for them to see. "He's the liar, the murderer," Silas yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. "The proof is right here. He killed Eleanor Vance for this deed." Deputy Miller looked from the powerful, immaculately dressed Thorn, the pillar of their community, to the dirt-streaked, grief-stricken war veteran. The young lawman was trapped, his face a mask of confusion and uncertainty, caught between a powerful lie and a desperate truth. Dr. Croft, however, looked past the accusations. His sharp, intelligent eyes took in the scene with a physician's diagnostic calm: the multiple gunmen, the dead horse, the raw grief on Silas's face. He knew Silas Kane. He knew him as an honest, solitary man who had borne the scars of war with quiet dignity. He also knew Bartholomew Thorne and the rumors of his ruthless ambition that always swirled just beneath the surface of the town's polite society. The doctor's gaze was steady, and in it Silas saw a flicker of belief. Just as the standoff reached a fever pitch, another rider appeared, galloping hard up the road. It was a young man with a determined jaw and eyes that held a familiar spark of blue. Samuel Vance, Eleanor's younger brother. "Dr. Croft," he called out, reining in his horse. "I came as soon as I got Eleanor's wire. She said she was in trouble, that she was heading here." His words cut through Thorne's lies like a razor, providing the corroboration Silas desperately needed. Samuel's eyes found Silas, then the open grave, and his face crumbled with understanding and grief. The net was closing. Thorne's face went ashen. With his lies exposed and witnesses mounting, he made a final, desperate move. He lunged for Deputy Miller, grabbing the young lawman and pressing the barrel of his revolver against his temple. "Nobody move!" Thorne snarled, his mask of civility stripped away to reveal the cornered animal beneath. "Drop your weapons, or the deputy dies!" A collective gasp went through the small crowd. The situation had spiraled into a hostage crisis. But Thorne had forgotten one detail, one silent, loyal observer. In that tense moment, Shadow, who had been hiding beneath the porch, shot out like a bolt of dark lightning. With a guttural snarl born of pure protective fury, he launched himself at Thorne, sinking his teeth deep into the man's arm. The sudden, searing pain made Thorne cry out, and his grip on the firearm faltered. The revolver clattered to the ground. In that instant, Silas moved, kicking the weapon far out of the land baron's reach. It was over. Not with a final, vengeful gunshot, but with the quiet click of handcuffs. Thorne and a wounded Riley were taken into custody. Armed with the true deed and Samuel's testimony, Silas ensured that Thorne's empire of deceit crumbled. He gave the water rights back to the small ranchers of the canyon, just as Eleanor would have wanted. He buried her on the hill overlooking the ranch, where the sunsets painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. And often, in the quiet of the evening, he would find Shadow sitting by her grave, a steadfast guardian of the peace they had finally won.